Hello and welcome to the two-man power trip of wrestling. Your host, JP John Poz. With me today, very special guest, former PNW star. He was a star in Puerto Rico. He was a star in Canada, Japan, you name it. Rocky Della Serra. Rocky, welcome in. How you doing?
How you doing, John? Nice to see you.
What's going on in your world? What are you up to?
I'm up to right now in the last few years, I should say, is that I've been writing a book with a gentleman. His name is Zachary Carey, and we originally started talking to each other on Facebook, say about just around COVID when COVID started back in May of 2020, and we kind of exchanged numbers and we started talking on the phone. And I should say, he is a wrestling historian. And so we started talking about wrestling, and the next thing happened, we just hashed it out, and we just said, well, why don't we just try and write a story, maybe write a book here on this my wrestling career and my biography. So we started that, and we've actually finally came to an end in December of 2024. We have a publisher. His name is Scott Teal, who's been involved in writing many books, also wrestling books, I should say, and he's come on board with us, and the book should be coming out in the next month or so.
Awesome. And the name? What's it going to be called?
Well, the name of the book is, and we, again, talking about hashing the name of the book out, we came up, Zachary said a few things, and I thought of something, and this and that, and it took a while actually to come up with the name, but I finally came to a conclusion, and it has a lot to do with my life, and my life in wrestling is wrestling with a Rocky life, like so, using my wrestling name Rocky, and that my life has been an up and down battle, and I'm sure I'm not the only one out there that's experienced that, but for sure, wrestling with a Rocky life just came and kind of made sense.
Very cool. How long were you in the business for? Because it seems like you started in the late 70s and kind of went on through. So it seemed like you had a pretty damn long career.
I had a pretty long career. I mean, considering I kind of got into wrestling at the end of the territory uh, wrestling time. Like I started in 1978, and I was pretty much out of wrestling by 1990 as far as doing the territory thing. The territory part of wrestling had just died with Vince McMahon Jr. monopolizing wrestling, and so yeah, I got out of it, and then I played around with a little bit of independent promoting, like a lot of the boys have done over the years, and of course that didn't work out because if you don't have a television show, you really got nothing, nobody to sell to, and posters and back in the early '90s, posters and newspaper ads or newspaper write-ups, it just wasn't enough to draw crowds to a venue, and so. Yeah, I packed that in because I mean it was hard, and so but I guess for me it kind of kept my foot in the business, and I did work for a few independent promoters myself, but I slowly got out of it, and here I am today.
When you broke in, how did you actually break in? Because I know obviously late 70s a little bit different than it is today. You just pay, a guy and the guy will train you. How do you break in the late 70s? And where did you break
Yeah, well I live in Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada now, but I was born and raised and grew up in Montreal, Quebec, Canada. Um, so I started in wrestling. Well, I had an older brother, Bob Della Serra, in the wrestling in the business, and he started in 1970 with the Grand Prix Wrestling promotion, that which was actually very hot, really good wrestling promotion at that time. In those days, there was two wrestling promotions in Montreal and both of them had television, and they were both drawing sellout crowds at the Montreal Forum. And but Bob started and he met up with Edouard Carpentier at the YMCA in downtown Montreal. Edouard told him that he was opening up a wrestling school, through his wrestling promotion, and it was called Grand Prix Wrestling School. He started there, and then one thing led to another. He got this wrestling gimmick called a UFO, and as a matter of fact, there was a German wrestling promoter that had come to Montreal, say a couple of years after Bob had broken in, and he saw Bob and he saw a few other wrestlers, and he had them booked, and they came to wrestle in Germany. So, make a long story short, Bob was in the business about 6-7 years before me. And so in 1977, 78, the promoter, Edmund Schobert from Hanover, Germany, and Bob ended up becoming not only just a wrestler for him, but kind of a talent scout for North American wrestlers to come to Germany. And he used to come to my parents' house, and my mother would make dinner. And so we met Bob's wrestling promoter in Germany. His name was Edmund Schobert. I was already training and working out real hard in the gym. I'd done some amateur wrestling. I'd done a lot of extensive weight training. I was in really good shape. I was young. I was 18, 19 years old. And Edmund Schobert looked at Bob and said, "You know what? You should get your brother into the business," because he says that's what the kind of young wrestlers that I want to bring in to Germany is some good young, good-looking wrestlers. So, anyways, and of course, it was always in my mind, in the back of my mind at that time too, that I eventually was going to give that professional wrestling a try, and so this kind of pushed me in a little bit faster than I thought I was going to get in. And Mr. Schobert said, well, to Bob, he says, if your brother gets trained, he can come to the October Festival in Hanover in 1978 in the fall time in September. And he says, I'd be happy to have him wrestle. So it was just a matter of me getting trained. And at that time, you mentioned that you did say that, how does somebody get into the wrestling business back in those days? Because, okay, Bob had the Grand Prix Wrestling School, but then, of course, that had folded, a couple of years later at the same time that promotion had folded. And so there was really nowhere for me to go learn, except there was a parish in Montreal called the St. John Baptist Parish that used to put on a wrestling show every Sunday afternoon for up-and-coming wrestlers that were training to become wrestlers as a fundraiser for the church. And they actually had a trainer there called Pat Girard, who he actually ended up wrestling in England and making a name for himself. And we're talking about 1950s, 60s. Anyway, he was the head trainer. And I don't know if you know the politics of Quebec, but if you're English or like I'm Italian, my ancestry, my parents are Italian, but I went to English school, so I was looked upon more as a English Anglophone than a Francophone French. So Bob told me, he says, well, listen, go talk to Pat Girard, and maybe you can learn at the Saint Jean Baptiste parish how to, of all places, a parish learning how to do professional wrestling.
Right, crazy.
And there was no cost. There was no charge. There was these guys just trained there. They had a wrestling ring in this building somewhere not too far from the church. And so I went up to Pat Girard and I asked him, I says, Pat, I'd like to get into the business, and is there a chance that I can come and learn here with all the other guys that are learning the business? And he looked at me and he says, well, he says no. He says, I can't train you. He says, go ask your brother, go ask Gino Brito, go ask Dino Bravo, but he says, I'm not going to be able to train you. And I was almost like in shock. So I kind of felt like he wasn't being fair to me because I was English. So I forget what the word is for that. Because I went to English school and I was more of an Anglophone English person, that he wouldn't train me. And so I came back home anyway. I told Bob, and he says, well, okay. let's see what else we can come up with. So one day, one afternoon, me and Bob went in my father's backyard. My father, well, he always likes to look after his grass, and his grass, his lawn was everything to him. So Bob shows me a couple of moves, couple of holds, and the next thing you know, my father comes back home, and we wore down his grass real bad. And so he came back home, and he was like, yelling and screaming and saying, "What did you guys do to my lawn? Next time, do that in the park." Blah blah blah. Make a long story short, Bob said, "Well, listen, once you get to Germany, I know some Japanese wrestlers there that are training this other Japanese wrestler that's going to be at this October festival for the wrestling promotion in Hanover, and you can train with them every day, and you'll pick up the business pretty quick." So yeah, I did train with them and stuff, but I mean, it just didn't give me enough time to get ready for that October festival. And so I kind of was a little bit SOL showing up there, really not being trained. And Bob just didn't have the time, and we didn't have a ring at that time. So there was just nowhere for me to train in Montreal before I went to Hanover. So I had to kind of learn on the fly. And yeah, so it was a little rough getting in. But, finally, after going through so many workouts with these Japanese wrestlers, and their names and they're well-known wrestlers in North America at that time anyway, Mr. Hito, Mr. Sakurada, and they were training a young wrestler called Mr. Hara from Japan, who was a professional rugby player. And so every morning for about 2 hours, and you know how hard the Japanese work out. And of course, I was accustomed to training hard in the gym, weight training, and doing lots of, cardio. I was already fit, and I looked the part of a wrestler. I just didn't have the ring, like the moves and the ring psychology. You got to get into that ring and wrestle in front of a crowd to really learn the trade of wrestling. So there's a lot of there's moves that you got to learn, and then of course you got to get into the ring and work with some really good professionals to learn the ring psychology.
So in Canada, when you are wrestling, is it MLW? Is it the Maple Leaf? Are you doing Vancouver? Or are you doing Stampede work? Like, where are you wrestling in Canada?
Well, when I did wrestle, yeah, I wrestled. So after Germany, of course, I went to wrestle in. I did a little bit. I did a couple of shows for Maple Leaf Wrestling. I remember doing that when I came back from Germany, and then then the next spring, of course, I had a couple of months there where I wasn't wrestling. In the springtime, I went to work in Ontario, Northern Ontario, for Larry Kazaboski, who was a kind of a promoter, kind of like the Bearman. I don't know if you remember the Bearman promoter in Ontario. He would just run shows, like spot shows here and there, and it was a good place to get some experience. And then next thing you know, I worked for Superstars of Wrestling, George Cannon. I worked for, in the Maritimes, I worked for Atlantic Grand Prix Wrestling, the following year from 1978 to 79. I worked for Emile Dupre with Atlantic Grand Prix. Worked some shows for Jack Britton when I came back. And then next thing you know, I got booked in Calgary and worked for the Hart family.
What was that experience like, working for Stu and the Harts?
Well, I was booked to go work there. And so I show up there in Calgary, and I flew all the way from Montreal on my own dime. And I went into the dressing room. They wrestled on this fairgrounds. I forget the name of the building, but I went in there, and Bret the Hitman Hart, at that time in 1980, was looking after, kind of like he was like the booker and kind of looking after the promotion, overseeing things, and also wrestling himself. And I went and talked to Bret, and I said, "Listen, I'm here to work, to start wrestling." And he looked at me and he says, "Rocky," he says, "I don't know what you're doing here." He says, "We don't need anybody right now. We're pretty full." So I was a little discouraged when I heard that, but I stuck around that night, and I said, "Well, here's my phone number. I'm going to be around town for a while. If you guys need anybody, let me know. So I get a phone call the next morning, and they told me I was booked in Edmonton. So, just meet us here, and we'll pick you up. And you're booked in Edmonton the following night, which Calgary was always Friday nights, and Edmonton was Saturday night. So I got booked in Edmonton. I worked that night, and next thing you know, I worked maybe 2, 3, maybe sometimes even 4 times a week. And my I had a friend there from Montreal, Joe Ventura, who also wrestled as Joe Lightfoot in the USA, and me and him, he was kind of like he started in the wrestling business at the same time as my brother Bob. I knew Joe before that, and so me and Joe kind of became friendly. And next thing you know, he told me, he says, Rocky, he says, Al Tomko, All Star Wrestling in Vancouver. They're looking. He needs a couple of guys to come and help him do some on the road shows for 2 months. And if we do that, he says he'll get us booked in Portland, Oregon, for Don Owens. And at that time, the Pacific Northwest, the promotion in Portland was really booming. It was a really good wrestling promotion, and it was like kind of like the talk of the wrestling industry. We got booked. And so we started there, say about July of 1980. So I'd worked for Stampede for a couple of months, worked for Al for a couple of months, and then bingo, I worked in Oregon and Washington State for Don Owens for a good 7 months.
Before we get to Portland, when you were in Stampede, did you work Brett or work Dynamite Kid at all? Like, were you working?
I did work Dynamite Kid a couple of times. I never worked Bret Hart, because they were using me like a baby face, and so I think at that point Dynamite had turned heel, and so I worked with the Dynamite Kid a couple times. I worked a few other wrestlers, E.T. Stanton, off the top of my head, maybe Lynn Denton. Such a long time ago, I can't remember all the wrestlers that I worked with, but yeah, for sure. I don't think I worked with any of the Hart family, but worked with a lot of, the other guys that were in the territory.
So when you get to Portland, who's the big star of the day in Portland? I'm guessing it's got to be Piper, right?
Well, Roddy Piper was he was like the top. Him and Playboy Buddy Rose were the 2 top guys. Roddy Piper, Playboy Buddy Rose, Rick Martel. They had Ed Wiskowski, also known as Colonel De Beers. They had Rip Oliver, Matt Bourne, who used to work as Doink the Clown, Buzzsaw Sawyer, Rip Oliver. The list goes on. There was a lot. Oh, the Sheep Herders, also known as the Bushwhackers, from New Zealand, who actually I saw them wrestle with the old Grand Prix days in 1969, 1970. So, to be able to work in the same territory with them and being a kid back in 69 and seeing them on television, and all of a sudden we're 1980 and I'm working in the same territory with them was definitely unique. Jonathan Boyd was there. Jay Youngblood. So I really learned a lot about the wrestling business. I think it really kind of hit me when I worked in Portland for Don Owens.
So what do you learn? Are you like learning how to survive on the road? You're learning like, hey, I got to get some more pay. Like, what do you like? Or meaning in ring? You're learning a lot.
I'm learning more in ring because although there was a lot of good wrestlers in the Maritimes, you got the Leo Burks. He was a great talent, but there was so many great talents that, ended up working for Vince, WWF. Like the names I just mentioned to you, Roddy Piper, Rick Martel, the Bushwhackers, because there was so much talent there. And then, like wrestling, sure, you learn when you get into the ring and you learn when you're on the road, but you really learn the business also when you watch. So I got to watch these great wrestlers that, really knew the art of the industry, and just to be able to watch them, taught me a lot. And of course, it was the first territory, of course, that I worked in the USA. And probably made more money there than I ever made anywhere else in wrestling at that point in my career.
What did you think about Don Owen?
Don was a great guy. I mean, he was a really good man. He was he's a farmer, but he was a really nice guy, and he was into wrestling heels, like because he was kind of like an old school wrestling promoter. So he didn't like all this glitz and showbiz and all this, although he knew that that's what, at the end of the day, that's what's going to draw the people. He liked to see a wrestler work, a heel work as a wrestler, like wrestle and get his heat wrestling. And so when I worked in Oregon, I ended up, I worked as a heel. And so I learned, and you learn a lot about the industry when you work, because I've done a lot more babyface work than I did heel style. So by working as a heel, because you kind of lead the match a little bit more when you're the heel, I got to learn more of the ropes of the industry. Yeah, the ring ropes.
What did you think about just the territory in general? I know you said you made more money there, which is great, but what do you think about the territory in general, the rides and everything?
Short trips, like our longest trip was basically Medford, was 250 south, and then sometimes we go to Vancouver, BC. That was about 300 miles, but basically, mostly every night we're doing like 40 to 100 miles a night. And you talk to any wrestler back in those days, and you tell them that you're doing 40 miles or 50 miles or 100 miles, they're going to say those are short trips.
Right, of course, yep.
And then we do Portland sometimes twice in the same week. So, and that's the town, Portland. That's where we live. So we were based out of Portland. So we would work, in the town that we lived in. So, that's like a 5-minute drive. So again, another short trip. So no days off, but you didn't need any days off because all the trips were were short. So you didn't have to survive those long trips that I encountered working in other wrestling territories and road trips. Yeah.
Right. When you're looking at obviously some of those guys that you mentioned, there's some crazy guys and there's some crazy names. Now, nobody in the business, of course, is perfect. I mean, if you really think about it, there's people doing different things, some extracurricular activities, maybe a little crazy. What do you think about some of those guys, like a Buzz Sawyer, like a Matt Bourne, like a Piper? I mean, some of the craziest guys, of course, mythologically in wrestling.
Right. Well, I thought that like Buzzsaw Sawyer, he did wrestle like a buzzsaw. So I thought he went a little bit too fast sometimes. And then, I think that he was on something. I don't know what he was on, but like after every match I worked with him, I could just see him on the outside the ring, keeled over, kind of like exhausted. Because when he worked in there, he was like really overly hyper. And so that's what I found about him being he just was like wanting to go 100 miles an hour. And, back in those days, wrestling, you don't have to go 100 miles an hour. I don't think you really have to wrestle 100 miles an hour. I mean, you have to kind of slow down sometimes and grab a hold and stuff. So I just thought he worked a little bit fast. And one time I picked him up for a body slam and he got up there so quick that his knee pad hit me right in the nose.
Wow.
So I actually got hurt. Kind of got a little bit of a potato, we call it in wrestling,
right?
With me picking him up for the body slam because he was so hyper and wanting to get up there. But I mean, he was a good guy and everything, and he worked real hard. He worked hard at the gym. But from what I understand, he died at a very young age. I think maybe 30 years old. I don't know what it was from, but yeah. So maybe he was taking too many, maybe steroids or who knows what.
Right.
But, yeah.
Yeah, he was early 30s and it was like the early 90s when he passed. It was,
Yeah.
crazy, kind of in his prime, really.
He's in his prime, and yeah, he passed away. So, and I think when I wrestled him, I don't think he was a whole lot older than I was. I was like 22 at that time. Maybe he was 23 or so, And I think he had just come. He's from Atlanta or somewhere down south near Georgia or something like that.
So how about Piper? Any sort of relationship with Piper? I know you worked him a few times.
I worked Piper a few times, and a lot of times that I worked with Roddy, I guess because I was kind of at that point in my career was an underneath kind of guy. He didn't get overly. He was the reverse of Buzzsaw. He was kind of taking it easy in there because he was complaining of back problems, and I think as his career kept going, you saw Roddy Piper less in the ring and more talking on the microphone. That was more his thing because he was such a great talker. He was a good entertainer on the microphone that he got his heat talking more than wrestling after a while anyway. And I think it was because some of the back problems he was having. So so our matches were okay. They were good matches and stuff, but I didn't feel like he was, or maybe he was just saving it for the big card matches, the big main event matches.
When you're in Portland, is that something where basically a place where you're saying to yourself, I want to stay here for a while. Like, I don't want to go any of this. This is a great setup here in Portland.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, for sure. I mean, you definitely don't want to leave Portland. It's pretty comfortable working there. Everybody that you work with there, knows what they're doing in the ring. They've got, so many years of experience. Everybody, yeah, there were everybody that worked there was a good worker. We even had Eric Embry, who's also a great worker. I worked with him there. Joe Lightfoot, my friend Joe, from Montreal. It was never a night that you were going in the ring and saying to yourself, "Oh my God, I'm working with a greenhorn." What are we going to do?
What about Matt Bourne? What about Maniac Matt?
Maniac Matt, like I said, he was a little bit in a fast, but he was a mini buzzsaw. But yeah, he was great to work with. Good worker, solid. Had some really good matches with Matt. Like I said, he's just another one of those polished professional wrestlers that knew what he was doing, and he comes from a family of pro wrestling. His dad was tough Tony Bourne, and Tony would sometimes come to the shows, and I got to meet Stan the Man Stasiak, who is from Montreal like I am, but Stan and I guess maybe got married in Oregon years ago before I got there, and was pretty much at the end of his career, so he wasn't working anymore in the ring, but he used to come over to see some of the shows sometimes. And so, yeah, I got to meet Stan Stasiak, who I used to watch when I was a kid, watching, like I had mentioned, there was Grand Prix wrestling, and then there was also, we call it in French, Les Aus la Lutte. Translated, it's All-Star Wrestling, and that was run by Jacques and Johnny Rougeau. So those two promotions, All-Star Wrestling and Grand Prix Wrestling, would be able to sell out the old Montreal Forum in Montreal back in the early 70s and 60s in the same month. Now, this is two different wrestling promotions going in to Montreal at the Forum, where the old the Montreal Canadiens, the hockey franchise, used to play hockey games. They used to sell out that Forum for professional wrestling. And there were two different promotions in the same month.
Wow. Shows you the loving fans in that area. Big time.
Montreal. Well, I don't know if you've ever read the book Midgets, Mad Dogs, and Screwjobs. They talk about Montreal being, a very important part of professional wrestling and the history of wrestling. Montreal was a great wrestling town, for sure.
Obviously, still to this day, still pretty popular as far as being.
Well, I haven't gone to a wrestling show in Montreal. I live here in Vancouver now. I can't say, but from what I understand, yeah, they still do pretty good up there.
As far as wrestling in that area and that Canada, obviously Gene Kiniski, former NWA champion. Which was kind of surprising. I was reading that you actually wrestled Gene.
I wrestled. Yeah, I wrestled Gene six times. I wrestled him one time, and Gene Kiniski is like an old school wrestler, where when I wrestled him in 1980, um, he doesn't like to do 15-minute matches. That for him, that's a short match. So um, we did 45 minutes, and I
Wow.
don't think I'd ever worked 45 minutes in the ring at that point in my life in a wrestling match. And so Gene says, "Well, we'll go. Yeah, let's go for a while." So we went about 45 minutes, and we're wrestling in Kamloops, BC. And I could remember giving Gene a forearm to the chest, and he's going, "Hit me harder, hit me harder." So I'm hitting him with everything I got, and that old guy, he must have been about 50 years old, and I was like 21, 22 years old. You know, when I hit 50 years old, I don't think I would ever tell a 21-year-old to hit me harder.
Right. Yep.
So he was, he was a tough guy. But you know what? Every match I had with him was a lot of fun. We did a lot of wrestling, and he just liked to keep moving. And for a big man, he could move pretty well.
Crazy thing about him, obviously Canada's greatest athlete, such a
Yeah,
great Olympia, but a great NWA world champion. I feel
for
like
sure.
for some reason forgotten a little bit in the annals of time. I mean, he beat Dez and loses Dory Funk, and it's almost like Funk and Dez are obviously more remembered. It's weird, but it kind of shouldn't be that way because he had a long title run.
Well, he did, and the thing is that when guys like when you work with wrestlers like the Dory Funks and of the world and stuff like that, um, and that they actually put you over and you get the belt. I mean, that means they have a lot of respect for you.
Yeah.
So Gene Kiniski was something else, and he was a former football player, Canadian football player. So maybe that's why he was so he moved around so well because of his football background.
So speaking of moving around, you're moving around all over the place. Obviously Canada, United States, but Puerto Rico as well. You kind of made a big name for yourself in Puerto Rico.
Well, yeah, I started in Germany, with my older brother Bob. But then, I ended up. I even did a couple of weeks in France. I also went to Japan one time. But yeah, Puerto Rico was. I had a good little push there. When I went to Puerto Rico, they they told me, listen, Rocky's not really a wrestling name, so we're going to call you Gino Della Serra. So I said, okay, you guys are running the show here, so
Right.
that's fine with me, but found out later on that Rocky could be a good wrestling name because there's a lot of guys that named themselves Rocky and made a good name for themselves.
Oh yeah.
Uh, but yeah, my run in Puerto Rico was really good. They were going to team me up with Eddie Gilbert.
Oh wow.
Yeah, Tommy and Eddie were working as partners there for like before I got there, and then Tommy was leaving, and so Jose Gonzalez came up to me because Jose and Carlitos were basically running the show there in San Juan, and Jose said, "Well, listen, we're going to team you up with Eddie Gilbert. I think you guys would make a good young tag team." And then one thing led to another. I think there was a wrestling convention because WWF at that time and WWC were kind of affiliated in some way. They had this convention. Next thing you know, I guess they approached Eddie Gilbert, Vince Sr., and they booked him in New York. And so that whole idea about me working in a team with Eddie, that fell apart. And so they ended up teaming me with Frenchie Martin, Pierre Martel.
Frenchie Martin, obviously very, very famous from WWF days. I mean, obviously in Canada too, but WWF days, I feel like.
Quebec City boy, yeah,
Yeah.
from Montreal, from Quebec, but also well known in Quebec. Of course, he started there because that's where he's from. And here talk about territory wrestling. Here's a guy that did so many territories, but was very, very successful in Puerto Rico. Caught on. He was in a team for many years. They were a really good heel tag team. Michel Martel, the actual real brother of Rick Martel. And I think something happened to Michel. I think he ended up having, I think it was a heart attack. in the ring and died. And then after that happened, I think they ended up turning Frenchie to becoming a babyface wrestler, and that's how, of course, Jose got his famous heart punch. I think Michelle had the heart attack wrestling with Jose.
Right.
But my experience with Jose Gonzalez and Carlitos Colon was really good. I got only good things to say about them. Jose was kind of like a big brother to me there, and Carlitos was a good man to work for. They were a great promotion. They were very professional, and they always expected everybody to work their hardest. And if you worked hard, they would definitely take care of you.
You mentioned Japan too. Work in Japan. You
I
worked
worked.
for UWF, right?
No, I worked there for a promotion. You know what? I can't remember the name of the promotion, um, but I got booked there through my brother Bob, through this one guy that used to be a wrestler called Tokyo Joe, and he was. I can't remember the name of the promotion. I know I was just there for like 5 or 6 days. We only wrestled twice. They paid us very well, and the promotion treated us really great. It was a great experience, but the flight was so long that I don't know. I ended up having a really upset stomach there when I got there, and it took me a few days to get over it. So there was one night I had to wrestle and suck it up, and that's the way it is in the wrestling business. You know, you wrestle sick or hurt or whatever. You get in there and you do as much as you can. And thankfully that first night I was there, I worked with my brother in the team, and there was a lot of times that I took care of him as a tag team partner, where his knees weren't feeling too good. So I did a lot of the work. And then that first night in Puerto Rico, me and Bob worked in a team, and he says, "Okay, brother, you can hold the rope a bit tonight." But yeah, the next night I felt better. I worked in a team with Leo, and the thing about Japan when you work there is it's not quite as much of a show as it is in North America. It's a bit of a different style of wrestling. You got to fight for whatever you can get in that ring, and if you don't fight, they don't have respect for you. So you gotta just keep going with them, because they'll eat you up alive if they can.
And the little bit of a
but they
style.
respect you. They respect you when you stand up to them.
Right, but a bit of a stiff style.
It's not a dangerous style, but a solid, very, very solid. And you got to fight for every hold or every move that you get there, especially if they know that you're not Abdullah the Butcher or Bruiser Brody or any of those big time freak type wrestlers that used to go work there. I was more of kind of not a regular looking guy, but just like a wrestler. But they seem to like to have North Americans that were very big men, like 6'4", 300 pounds.
Yes.
And
Yep.
when I went there, I was 5'11", 220. So I fought for everything I got in the ring, and but it went okay. And the thing about them though is that they take care of you there, and they pay you well.
Interestingly enough, you did end up in Memphis too, right? I mean,
I
speaking of
did
like
go to
wacky,
Memphis.
weird styles, Memphis, that seems like a odd territory, but an awesome territory.
It's an awesome territory. It was kind of like a little bit similar to Oregon. There was a lot of good talent there, a lot of good wrestlers. So, working every night. I remember wrestling with Coco Beware before he got his big break with the WWF. And I remember having a headlock on Coco. And of course, he used to put so much oil on his hair and his body. Sometimes I can remember vividly trying to hold on to a headlock with him, and it was a bit of a challenge because his head was so slippery. But yeah, I got to work with Coco Beware, and I got to meet the great Jerry Lawler. I traveled with Jerry Lawler, and one thing I remember the most about Jerry Lawler is his car, his license plate, actually said King on on it. So that was kind of funny. But yeah, I enjoyed wrestling in Tennessee, and of course we didn't only wrestle in Tennessee. We wrestled in Indiana, Kentucky. I was even one time we worked in some town in Arkansas. So yeah, it was a good experience.
When you're in Memphis, you're not there for long, though, right? I mean, you kind of in and out. You're not really there for too long.
I was there for a few months. I just felt that at that point, I don't know, um, the territory wasn't doing like really, really well. And I don't know, I just had this feeling. I said, well, you know what? I think I'll just go back to Canada. And I ended up getting booked and I went back to work for Emile Dupre in the summertime. Um, and I don't know what hit me, but one day I just said to myself, and like I said, it's 1985, so it's a long time ago. It's almost 40 years ago.
Yeah.
I just said to myself, I'm gonna leave Memphis. But I remember working. Jerry Jarrett was the boss, and he told me, he says, you're a good hand here. We like having you here, and there's no reason for you to leave. But just something in my gut said I was gonna leave, because I mean, talk about long trips. We had long trips there. It wasn't like Oregon and Washington State where 40, 50 miles. We're talking some long road trips every week.
Oh yeah. So back in Canada, more relaxed, I guess. That's kind of your home.
Well,
home
just at that time in my life, I don't know what was going on inside my mind, but I just felt like going back to Canada. But when I was in Puerto Rico, I mean, talk about short trips. I mean, our longest trip there was 110 miles. Most of the times we were wrestling locally, around San Juan or in San Juan. And then they would, my first time there, they would fly us to Trinidad every 2 weeks, and we'd work in Port of Spain, Trinidad.
Wow.
Yeah. So, but yeah, I mean, my time in Puerto Rico, I never want to leave there. I mean, the sun's always shining. The beach was across the street from where I lived. The gym was there. I had a regular routine. I remember going to the gym, and then all of a sudden, here comes Dory Funk. He says, "Hey, buddy, let's run there." So we jogged to the gym, worked out, and then it was workout in the morning, the beach in the afternoon, and going to work at some wrestling show at night. So I really enjoyed my time in San Juan, Puerto Rico, for sure.
Passionate crowd too, right? I mean, they're great fans.
Very passionate crowd. I remember my first year there. Frenchie Martin's in the ring with Abdullah the Butcher, and so they asked the wrestlers to go in there and do like a pull apart, like pull them apart because they're having a out and out brawl match, and it's gotten out of hand. And so we go to the ring, about 4 of the baby faces, 4 or 5 heels, and pull them apart. And I'm walking up, like we're kind of walking fast, me and Tommy Gilbert, and I get a rock, like a kind of like almost like a boulder, and it hits me in the chest. And Tommy Gilbert, Eddie's dad, looks at me and he goes, "Don't sell it. Don't sell it." I'm going, "What do you mean don't sell it? If it hurts, I'm going to keel over. That's the natural thing to do." Yeah. Well, it hit my chest, and it didn't bother me because I guess I spent so many years under the bench press that I built up a pretty good chest. And it didn't hurt, but I was shocked because if it was like 6 inches higher, it would have smashed all my teeth out of my mouth. And lucky enough for me, it hit me in the chest. So talk about passionate. And they were probably aiming it at Abdullah the Butcher, but I ended up getting the brunt of it.
Yeah, you always hear that. They always throw crap, like batteries and stuff, and it's just crazy.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, for sure. I mean, the security, I mean, I was always a babyface there, so I didn't know what that was all about. But from what I understand, that all the villain wrestlers would meet at a certain hotel, and on Saturday nights, because we wrestle in San Juan every Saturday night, and they would pick them up at the hotel, and all the villains would go in the same bus, and they would drive them to the show. And then we wrestled on these baseball stadiums. One was called Hiram Bithorn Stadium, which it was named after the first Puerto Rican Major League Baseball player, Hiram Bithorn. I guess he started back in the 50s. So they named the stadium after him. And then there was another stadium called Juan Lubriel. So we would do those two stadiums for wrestling on Saturday nights. And I mean, you'd see security men walking around with these long green pants, like army pants, and they had these long bats. And so they had to have like a lot of security there to protect the villain wrestlers coming to the ring.
And you were a tag champ there as well, right? You and
We were tag
Frenchie?
team. Me and Frenchie had the tag team championship belts there. We beat the Moondogs, for the belt. So I had a good, the first time I went there, I was there for a good 7 months. Got a good stay there. 7 months in San Juan is like a paid vacation. The money was good, and and then I went back in 1985 also. So I was there the first time in 1982, and then one day I get a phone call from Jose Gonzalez, and he says, "You want to come to San Juan, work out here for a few, like 4 or 5 months?" And I said, "Yeah, you bet." It's January in Montreal. I'll catch the next plane out.
Right.
So,
Oh my God.
so yeah, I went, and then when I finished up in San Juan, they sent me to work for the Savoldi family, and I worked there for a couple of weeks in Boston, and then from there just went back to Montreal. And then after I went back home to Montreal, I went to Tennessee, worked there for a while, and then worked in the Maritimes. So I've done a lot of the territory wrestling. Like I did a lot of it, and I got the tail end of it from 1978 to 1988.
Man, you were everywhere. Crazy. Like you said, Germany, France, Trinidad, Puerto Rico, Canada, United States. Jeez, everywhere.
Oregon, yeah, in Memphis, worked in northern part of USA, like in Vermont. When I went to work there for the Savoldis, we worked in Massachusetts, Rhode Island. So I got to work in quite a bit of the USA. I did every province in Canada except for Manitoba, and I've been in every small town from Labrador, Newfoundland to the Queen Charlotte's in BC. So you'd have to look at the map and check that out, and I've wrestled in a lot of small towns and big towns in Canada for sure.
So when you look at it and you just look at obviously the totality of your career, do you have a favorite territory? Or what is your favorite territory?
Well, that's a good question. I'd have to say it would have to be a toss-up between Puerto Rico and Portland, just because the trips were short. So you had time for yourself and your own personal life. So you weren't on the road all the time. But you wrestled a lot, which I liked wrestling, and you made some good money. Makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you have a least favorite?
A least favorite? Whoa, that's a good question. I don't really have a least favorite because I love the wrestling business. So I can't say I have I'll have to say, okay, my stay in Alberta working for the Hearts was my least favorite, just because I guess, and I didn't have a whole lot of experience when I got there. So I was lucky to get the experience that I got working there a few times a week. But, the trips were long when I did work, and the weather was bad in the wintertime there. So it was pretty dangerous, and there was a lot of car accidents. So I'd have to say maybe working for the Hearts was my worst, or my most unfavorite territory.
So this is interesting because you work with so many different guys. I mean, we talk about Gene Kiniski, Piper, Dynamite Kid. I mean, so many awesome guys. Who's some of your favorite guys that you work with? Because some of the guys on this list are like remarkable. It's like, oh my God, he worked, this guy. Wow. Then this guy is crazy.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, like, I got to work with Rick Martel. I got to work with this one kid from Ontario. He was about my age, Ron Ritchie. And I was almost married to him in the Maritimes one year, working with him every night. And so working with these kind of wrestlers like Rick Martel, Ron Ritchie. I remember working with my brother's tag team, or I worked my brother actually in quite a few shows where he was the heel and I was the baby face. But working with these kind of wrestlers like Ron Ritchie, Rick Martel, my brother Bob's partner when he was a fabulous kangaroo in Puerto Rico, Don Kent. These guys are masters of the art of wrestling. So working with them was so easy, and it's like poetry in motion. It was like, it's like dancing with a partner, and you get the partner, everything just kind of flows. I don't know if you ever see the show Dancing with the Stars.
Oh, yeah.
Well, the stars always dance with the dancers that are professional dancers. These guys were really good professionals. And so working with them, when the announcer would go 15 minutes and it's already time to go home into the finish of the match, it's like, what? I'm just getting warmed up. And then I wrestled some guys where the announcer would go 5 minutes. Oh my God, I'd say to myself, I got another 10 minutes with this guy. He's a crowbar. Yeah. So there's definitely a difference between wrestling with somebody who's got how can I say, is a master of the art of professional wrestling and somebody who's not.
Absolutely. And did you work Dory Funk?
I did work Dory Funk Jr. There's another master, the master, Dory Funk. I worked him in Portland, Maine on television. And, the same thing, working with him was great. I mean, it was a little bit different because we were on TV. And, of course, they were kind of using me to set him up with Carlos in Portland. But in Portland, Maine, I should say, not Oregon, but Portland, Maine, for a main event match down the road. And working with Dory was, again, the master of the art of professional wrestling for sure.
Yeah. Now, as we start to hit the wind end here, we head towards the finish. What is next? I know you mentioned the book. Anything else wrestling related you got?
I got nothing else wrestling related except there's a couple of local promotions here in Vancouver that want me to do a special referee in Abbotsford, BC on February 8th and March 8th. And of course I'm using this to also promote my book because, that's the objective right now. I'm also going to Portland, Oregon for the Portland Wrestling Expo coming up in Portland, Oregon at the Holiday Inn on February 22nd. I'll be promoting my book there, and it's kind of like a wrestling convention. There's going to be a lot of wrestlers that wrestled in Oregon years ago, like from what I understand, Lynn Denton, Mean Mike Miller. Who knows? I think maybe Ed Wiskowski will be there. Ricky Santana, from what I heard, is going to be there. Moondog Moretti. And I'm going also because the reason I'm going is because I want to promote my book. And of course, that's my biggest objective right now is to see this book get off the ground. It's a book that, like I said earlier in in our podcast, that I started doing with Zachary Carey from, he's actually from outside of Boston, Lynn, Massachusetts. Like I said, we started talking on Facebook. Anyway, we've been working on this for so many years that the book is going to be about, my life growing up, how I got into sports, how I survived, in life. I was, when I was a kid growing up, I was an introvert. And, professional wrestling helped me. I've always had the extrovert in me, but professional wrestling pulled the extrovert out of the introvert. So today I'm an introvert extrovert. So that's what we're talking about in this book and how hard it was growing up in a family of 5 and having 3 older brothers and an old-fashioned Italian dad. And I went to really strict school in in Montreal, Catholic school. Growing up wasn't easy, and wrestling was kind of a bit of an outlet for me when I finally got into it, and I kind of found myself a little bit in professional wrestling, and it kind of set me up for my life after wrestling, to be how can I say, be more a little bit more self confident, and make me be able to be to do well in my career after wrestling.
Where could everybody get the book?
They can get the book online. They can get it at the Portland Sports, not the Portland Sports Arena, but the Holiday Inn on February 22nd. It'll be sold online. You name it, it'll be everywhere. And that's why I'm here today with you, John. And I really appreciate you having me on, an opportunity to promote this. It's the book's about not only my life, my biography, but it tells you a lot about how all the territories that I worked in and how it all worked and how it all unfolded, and how the rest of my life ended up unfolding.
Yeah.
And I just want to say, I ended up finally finding true love. I got married last summer.
Oh, nice. Awesome.
At 60,
Congrats.
I'm 66 now. I met this lady. Her name is Layla. And I met her when I was 64. And we got married last summer in Finland, where her parents are from. And we got married there. And we went to Rome. We went to Spain. We had a great holiday. And so true love is out there. It's just a matter of when. And I finally found my true love
Nice.
2 years ago. So I just wanted to mention that also at the same time. So the whole book is how, life can unfold for you. There's ups and downs, and that's why it's called Wrestling with a Rocky Life.
Now, where can everybody find you on social media and otherwise?
Well, I'm always on Facebook. I'm, kind of a bit of a old timer, so I haven't ventured onto any of the other sites like Instagram, or what's that other one, that new one that they got now? TikTok or stuff like that. But I'm on Facebook. So if you want to get the book, you can also try and reach me there. I can find a way to get a book to you.
Awesome. Rocky, thank you so much for all the time tonight. I really appreciate it.
I appreciate that, John. Appreciate you having me. And yeah, thank you.